Are you completely burned out, depleted, and resentful from spending all the time you do advocating for your PDA child or teen? So this is an incredibly common experience. It's one that I've been through myself, but I've also witnessed hundreds of families go through this dynamic where, because of the nature of our unique experience as parents and the neurotype of our children and teens, it can feel almost impossible to make true headway and progress when we're trying to advocate for the needs and well-being of our children. Why is this? Primarily, it's because pathological demand avoidance does not yet exist as a technical diagnosis. I don't know why those confettis were coming down, but it doesn't exist as a diagnosis in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It produces very paradoxical behavior, often that can be explained by other diagnoses that do exist in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and because of masking, right, where our children appear as one version in one context and a totally different version in another. So today I want to help you guys get unstuck and free up a little of that energy that you've been using sort of banging your head against the wall in the vein of advocacy. So we're going to flip the script on it today. And we're going to talk about 3 concepts that I wish I had known sooner in my journey and that I teach more in depth in the Paradigm Shift program, but I'm really excited to share them with you today. So let's start by talking about, well, actually, before we start, I'd love if you guys just tapped an emoji or something if you feel burned out from advocating. And this can include not just schools, but with therapists, pediatricians, friends, in-laws, grandparents, your partner. Okay, because this is a theme I have seen and witnessed, a pattern I have seen with all the families that I have worked with. Okay, so if that's you, or if you're listening to this as a podcast, take a moment to reflect if, yes, I am expending all this energy, I am burned out. I'm also using my nervous system as a primary accommodation for my child's nervous system, and something's got to give. So that's the point I reached as well. So how do we free ourselves and get unstuck, and why is this so important? So I want to share with you guys a story that is specific to my lived experience with my son and the trial and error and painful experience of trying to advocate and what I learned along the way. Okay, so one of the main reasons that my family moved to Michigan from Washington, D.C. was to have access to more school resources and better public schools. Okay. So we actually moved 3 blocks away from where I'm sitting right now. I can almost see it, a public school. We bought a house nearby where my son's cousins would go. Okay, so a big part of our decision making and our idea for a more peaceful environment for my PDA son who was in burnout was being able to access good public schools, and where we live had this reputation for also having good special education services. So fast forward to March of 2020 and the pandemic started. So my son was in preschool, or he was sort of in a daycare, and both my sons came home, okay? And were at home with me for 6 months. And basically we were doing a mixture of homeschooling and unschooling and our own daycare in the home. And it was a disaster because I didn't fully understand PDA and my PDA son was resisting everything. So needless to say, by the time 6 months later rolled around and my PDA son Cooper was about to start kindergarten, I was super excited, and I knew he was outgoing, he was social, one of his special interests was other children, and I felt very optimistic for his experience. However, even though he had received an autism diagnosis, the school did not qualify him to do any in-person services, and he was supposed to simply sit in front of a Zoom call in kindergarten and participate, okay? So, I set up his room. I did everything that I'm sure all of you did to encourage whatever age child you had or teen to participate in online schooling. Within 4 or 5 days, he was getting up from the Zoom calls, and really just like the first one of the day, and screaming and having very violent meltdowns, running outside of the front door. It was an extreme situation, but when I was corresponding and trying to provide the information about PDA, about my son's autism diagnosis, what I was receiving was basically like, this is your responsibility. You need to make sure he attends, or else he is not going to be meeting the requirements for attendance. Okay? So I, for the first week, was trying to restrain him in order to participate. But I was like, I'm not doing this. I'm not restraining my son physically so he can like show his face on a Zoom call. Flash forward over the next year, it was very difficult for me to advocate, which I continued to do, sharing information, trying to persuade, trying to convince, trying to explain PDA. And what I received was daily phone calls. We're going to, share the information on his attendance with Child Protective Services, and my husband and I sought a lawyer. Okay, so this goes into the advocacy space of like, we share information, we try and explain, we try and persuade, we try and convince, and then we often move to reward sanctions with those we're trying to convince. So what's a lawyer? It's like threatening punishment to the school. Okay, so we're not getting these accommodations. We're back and forth. We're having these, it's me and my husband with 8 other people on the Zoom calls from the special education department being like, he's not going to qualify, blah, 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 through the school system. And he did okay. Like at the very last 6 weeks, they would have some in-person schooling. So he would attend like 1 or 2 days a week, and his teacher was great, intuitively accommodating him, and he did well. Then we moved to the next, but I am so anxious, right? After a year of back and forth with the school and all this advocacy and them not believing me and feeling crazy, right? Like I'm getting on a Zoom call trying to explain PDA to 8 people who are gaslighting me. Oh, he doesn't do that at school. PDA doesn't exist. All the things that I know all of you have heard, and that has triggered your nervous system, right? Like the types of sensations I would feel in my body during these calls was like chest pains, tightening of my jaw. I would start shaking, right? It was a very difficult experience that I know many of you have had because, you're all intelligent people and you're resourceful. And I know that many of you are very highly educated and able to articulate what's going on with your child. And it's like you're just getting a blank stare or a brick wall. Okay, so flash forward to the next year, we had a 504 plan set up, which is a disability plan here in the United States. And, some of the most basic requests were, having an opportunity to use like a fidget or being able to chew on things because he was an oral regulator, not ranking him on behavior with the other students because he was coming home and having these insane meltdowns. And we were also trying to advocate to get the service dog allowed to go to school with him. And at that time he had 2 autism diagnoses, one from a large university here. So this was the school simply not respecting those diagnoses. I'm not sharing this to like throw shade at the school. I'm sharing this to illustrate that I have also been through what I think a lot of you are either going through or have been through with your advocacy experience. And it leaves you with a sensation of like, why can't I explain this? Like, what am I doing wrong? So what am I doing wrong? And why can't people like grasp what I'm saying, right? So flash forward, we had conflict, we had lawyers involved because of the service dog and wanting to have him there. The school had put up signs when they learned about the service dog no dogs allowed at the school. Like, it was starting to get adversarial, and I knew we weren't making headway. And I knew even if we got him, quote, the accommodations that he needed, I was going to be hyper vigilant, and I wasn't going to trust that he was going to have a sense of felt safety in his body, which is what he needs to learn. Okay. But again, as I said, we live a couple blocks away, and this was a couple months into his first grade year at the public school. And we had gone to the playground of the public school over the weekend to play. And on Monday morning, I got another phone call from the school, and I noticed they had left a message. I didn't answer because I was too anxious from all the interactions. And my heart was racing, and I was so scared and anxious about what this message was on my phone. And when I listened to it, it was just a message from the front desk saying, "Hey, we found your purse on the playground. You must have left it here over the weekend." But it was a tipping point for me because I realized in my body I was having a panic response just corresponding or interacting with the school. And I was so hypervigilant and scared about what was going on at school and the cumulative nervous system activation of my son, and then having to deal with the fallout of that once he came home. And it was just like this aha moment where I was like, I'm not doing this anymore, right? Like, it's not worth my energy. I don't have the energy. I'm having a trauma response. We need to do something different. Like, this type of advocacy is not working. Okay. So what did I learn from that? And what did I learn from working with hundreds of families who went through the same type of advocacy mindset that I did that hasn't worked for them? Okay. The three concepts I'll talk about, but at the heart of what I'm going to say is the shift was the realization that I can never control or convince another person. Truly, if they don't want to understand or learn or make changes, there's nothing I can say, explain, persuade, or convince that will change that. And actually, it's not my responsibility. What my responsibility is to decide what I'm going to do in response to these unchanging constraints. And for many of us, we have a school, a therapist, a pediatrician, a friend, an in-law, a grandparent, or a spouse who is not going to change in response to traditional advocacy. Okay? So here are the three concepts that have helped by flipping the script. The first one is a tool from nonviolent communication, which is making a nonviolent communication request using what's called the PLATO framework, PLATO. So nonviolent communication is a style of communication by Marshall Rosenberg. You can read the book, and I'll cite it in this tile. But PLATO just means that we're making a request, a very specific granular request, and specifying the person, location, action, timing, and object of the request. And that in response, the person we're asking, whether it's our husband or a school administrator, can either say yes or no. Okay? And from that yes or no, we get data as parents that allows us to make informed decisions. So we're still making the decisions. So we can either get a yes to our request, which means we've made progress. We can get a no, but we could do this, which leads to productive negotiation, or we could get a full stop no, which just means we have the data as parents to make decisions in response to that and move into boundaries. Okay, so I want to ground this for you with 3 different examples. So often where I see the families that I work with, and I've experienced this too, get stuck with advocacy with schools is that we're trying to convince them that PDA exists, okay? And we get into this stuck place where we're triggering their ego in the sense that it's not something they've been trained in, they don't have the professional background, and they don't have expertise in it, and we're as parents triggering that resistance and getting stuck. Okay, so what can be a lot more productive is, instead of saying, trying to educate on PDA, is really honing in specifically on what your child needs. Okay, so for example, when I was advocating with the school, I would say things like, trying to explain what PDA was, like, his nervous system needs to feel safe. And they would sort of nod their heads and be like, yeah, okay, but like still revert to behavioral strategies because it wasn't grounded. So how do we use PLATO? For example, I would like to make a request. Is it possible that during circle time, my son can have a red card that he can hold up, and when he holds up the card, he can move to the sensory corner for the duration of the circle time, for the half hour of circle time, okay? So I've made this really specific using the PLATO framework. The person is my son. The location is the circle and the sensory corner. The action is him raising the red card and moving to the sensory corner. The time is very specific. It's the duration of circle time for 30 minutes. And if there's an object, which there is, the red card, we mention that too. Okay, so that's super specific for a teacher or an administrator, and they can either say, yes, that's possible, we can do that, without needing to understand why. Okay, all you're saying is making a request for your child's needs. You don't have to, the other person does not have to fully understand PDA to say yes or no. Okay, they're only responding to, can we actually implement this in the classroom? And often when we move to those specific requests, rather than the convincing, there can be a yes. There can also be a no, because we don't have a sensory corner, but we have a sensory room down the hall. Maybe we could get the OT to come, check in during circle time, right? So we're moving into problem solving instead of conflict. And then the third outcome, which is a flat out no, which happens sometimes, is also movement and progress for you as a parent, because you can see clearly whether or not you're gonna be able to keep your child in this situation, okay? Because when we're staying at the convincing level of like, PDA is a nervous system disability, it's part of the autism spectrum, my son needs another safe nervous system, we're nodding and smiling along and agreeing with these like conceptual ideas, or the administrator of the school is, but we're not actually getting down to the nitty-gritty of what we can implement. Okay, so I'm going to pause for a second. Is this making sense to those of you who are listening? I'm going to give you 2 more examples of the PLATO framework, one with husband or partner and one with in-laws. So feel free to tap a heart or an emoji or a thumbs up, just so I know that you guys this is resonating. And again, for those of you who just tuned in, I learned this the hard way, okay? I did not do this in my journey with school. Okay, so let's go to husband, all right, which is definitely a dynamic that I see a lot in my work with families. So, we have this big picture problem where usually the father is not fully on board with the PDA lens or a non-behavioral approach to your child. And so as the spouse, what do? We move into advocacy. We share information, we explain, we share articles, we try and persuade, and then we might, because we're human, even move into that reward sanction dynamic that we're trying to move away from with our children of like, I'm going to sort of punish you because you're not learning the stuff I'm sharing with you by like, getting mad at you or whatever. Okay. So let's say the dynamic with which we have been approaching our partner is, I really need more help from you when you get home from work. I'm exhausted and I need more help with my PDA kid. And, in defense of the partner or the husband, Often this is a nebulous concept and they don't actually know what to do. So we can use the PLATO framework to be specific. For example, when you get home for work, I'd like to make a request. When you get home from work, can you please sit with Cooper while he's watching an iPad for 20 minutes so that I can take a shower? Please do so without looking at your phone and while looking at his screen. Okay? The partner does not need to know the logic behind that of like, if you're looking at your screen, then you're not giving the undivided attention that my son needs, and then I'll not be able to take the shower because he will be escalating and you'll be distracted. None of that needs to be communicated. It's just a simple request, right? And we have the person, so the husband, location, couch, action, sit next to and don't go on your phone. Watch the iPad with the child. Time, 20 minutes, so I can shower. And then object is the phone itself of like, put your phone away so you're doing the undivided attention. And you're making a request. And a request means the person can say yes or no. Okay? So it can either be a yes, which is progress. It can be, no, I really need to go upstairs and take off my clothes and unpack my briefcase. But if I have 10 minutes, I can then give you more than 20 minutes for a shower. I can give you an hour, right? So we have negotiation, we have progress. Or it can be a no, which is a data point for your relationship. Okay, and that might be a little triggering, but this is like how we make progress. Final example, in-laws, using the PLATO framework from nonviolent communication. Let's say there's an expectation that you come over once a month for dinners on Sundays, okay? And every time you do, your child is not able to access the accommodations like screen time, not sitting at the table, not having questions thrown at them constantly because of the discomfort you have of communicating, or the inability seemingly to communicate or advocate so that the behavior of your in-laws will change. Okay, this is again why we get so depleted, because we're explaining, we're sharing information, we're trying to persuade, right? So instead of saying like, I really need you to understand PDA, please read this book on it, which is like, again, in the clouds and hard for people, we can make a nonviolent communication request using this framework. In-law, I'd like to make a request. When we come over on Sunday, can John please eat in the den? And can you please not ask him about what he's eating or what's on his iPad? I'm using a lot of examples with the iPad because it's easy, but you can use this how you want. So, person, the in-laws and John. Location, the den at their house. Action, refraining from commentary or asking questions. Time, I should have specified this, but during the dinner. Object, the iPad. Okay? So, again, they can say yes, and that's progress, and then we can observe whether or not they do it behaviorally. They can say no, but, and negotiate. No, but, he can use my bedroom because grandpa's working on some stuff in the den. Or we can say no, and that's data. Okay, that's data about whether or not you need to start setting boundaries. Okay? So I see a question. Will this be posted because I missed the beginning? Absolutely. It will be posted. It will be on YouTube, and I will turn it into a podcast. So please don't worry if you just tuned in. Okay, so great question, Alina. What if they say yes, but do it anyways? Okay, so we're going to move into concept number 2, which is setting boundaries, okay? Boundaries are the next step. Right? So let's say you've made all these nonviolent requests and you've really made the requests, you've made them specific, you have collected your data on the yeses, the no, buts, and the negotiation and the no's. and you're learning more about what's actually going to work for your family. But where the rubber hits the road is where we see whether or not the yes is actually a yes, okay? So, for example, let's say you've made that nonviolent request to the school. They're like, yes, absolutely. Your child can raise a little red card and move to the safe corner where there's sensory stuff. But in practice and implementation, every single day, the teacher is like, put that fidget away, or you can't leave the circle, right? Then we see consistently violations of the yes. This is data. Or we have the in-laws, and this is all very common, right? This is coming from my experience of working with hundreds of families and my own experience. So you are not alone in this, and it's not your fault. You're not doing anything wrong. So the in-laws are like, yes, absolutely, your child can, go in the den or go in grandpa's bedroom or go in the den to eat their food. But then there's this running commentary and judgment of you that makes it a space where there's not felt safety, and then your child activates, maybe they mask it, and then you come home and there's an explosion over and over and over again. Okay? This is when we need to start setting boundaries, and this is when we really flip the script, because where most of us get stuck, myself included, is we, instead of setting boundaries, we focus on trying to convince others to change their behavior. Okay? And there are lots of people out there, even people we love, who are not going to change their behavior based on our convincing, based on our preferences. Okay, so what we need to do is change our behavior. What does this mean? It means if you repeatedly see that the yes is actually a no in practice, that there's continual commentary, or there's continual violation of the 504, which was the case in our family, right? Where my son used a pacifier outside of school, but during school, one of the very basic things that he needed as a child with an autism diagnosis was jewelry, being able to use jewelry and something at the end of his pen that he could chew on for oral regulation. Okay, he was repeatedly punished and had comments upon and had these accommodations taken away from him, even though they were written into the 504. Okay, that's the plan to accommodate his disability. So then we have to start setting boundaries. And this is where it starts to get uncomfortable in our bodies, because a lot of us are fawners, people pleasers, high functioning codependents, etc. Especially if you are a PDA identifying yourself and have an appeasement or a fawn response, which is a nervous system response where you're automatic yesing, you're hyper vigilant to other people's well-being and emotional responses over your own. It's a nervous system response. So if a grandparent is continually commenting and activating your child after they've said they won't, you only have two choices. Your choice is to continually allow the boundary violation and continue to try and convince them and waste your energy and time, your precious, precious energy, or you change your behavior, which is, I think we're not going to be coming for Sunday dinner. It's not working for our family. And that's the hard part in implementation. And I know this because when I set boundaries, I often get like chest pains. So as you guys are listening, either on the podcast or here, feel free to drop into the chat what your body does when you set a boundary. You can just share one word or like the sensation that you feel. Because this isn't easy. This is not easy. So for example, the boundary I set with, when the school was continually calling me about my son's attendance for not showing up on the Zoom, my initial response to that was, I need to make him do it because that's the rule. But then I realized my sacred boundary is that I will not physically restrain my child to be on a Zoom call. That's my boundary. I'm not going to do it. I'm changing my behavior, right? And we have the power and the agency to do this, and setting boundaries, I think, is the thing that actually shifts other people's responses to us, but we set boundaries for ourselves and our family. Okay? This may or may not change their behavior, right? The grandparents might realize like, oh, mom's serious about this, or the in-laws like, oh, she's not coming to Sunday dinner unless we change our behavior. Okay, and I just want to share with you guys one of the books that has been most profoundly impactful for me on this topic of boundaries, which is Boundary Boss by Terry Cole. That's not a collab plug, it's just a like, this book saved my life plug. Finally, if we have repeated boundary violations over and over and over again, then we can move to pruning. The pruning topic, it's the third concept that we're talking about today, is removing people from your life either temporarily or permanently. The first time I heard this concept was in a New York Times article about adult friendships, where often in order to open up space for new friendships and more energy, we need to prune, like a rose bush, old friendships that aren't aligned or reciprocal, okay? So in an extreme case, and I think all of you have gone through this or will go through this, we have had to prune certain people from our lives if they repeatedly violate our boundaries. This might look like moving to a different school, and I acknowledge the financial privilege I had to do that, but it could be also on a much smaller level. So let me give you some examples. One family I worked with, the mom had a trusted hairdresser in the sense that she gave great haircuts. However, every time she made conversation about, how are you doing? How are your kids? The mom would share, and there was a lot of judgment from the hairdresser. And what did the mom keep doing? Trying to convince, trying to explain, trying to share about PDA, etc., etc. Expending all this energy while she's supposed to be relaxing and getting her haircut. She did attempt to make a request. I'd like to make a request that you don't, comment on my child or whatever. And, oh yeah, sure, that's fine. And then there's repeated boundary violations. And so eventually the decision point was, do I want to keep going to this hairdresser, or do I want to prune this person and find someone else? And I acknowledge that it takes so much energy when your executive functioning is tapped to find a new hairdresser. But because your most primary resource for supporting your child is your energy, it has to be protected. Okay, this might be a therapist who is great in other ways and has been very supportive to you in other seasons of your life. However, they keep saying things like, yeah, I think you just need to be stricter, or yeah, I think he's letting you run the show. That's not felt safety with a therapist if you feel like you're not seen or heard, and you may need to prune them. A support group on PDA, where you have a bunch of people freaking judging you because you're making different decisions than they are, and emotionally dumping into the space, okay? But you feel like you need to be there because you're learning information. But guess what? Your energy is being tapped, right? And there's all this argument and judgment, and everybody's trying to convince other people to think a different way. Whereas what you really need to do is tune into what you think, what works for your family, and set the boundary of like, this space isn't good for my mental health, whatever that is. Unfollow people. You're allowed to do this. You're allowed to prune, and it can be temporary. It can be like for the next year. I'm going to prune this component of an old friend group because every time we have dinner, all they talk about is their neurotypical kids, and I'm so triggered that I leave feeling resentful and like I hate my life, right? So we have the responsibility to do this, and I will tell you from my experience personally, from not doing it this way and from working with hundreds of families who have PDA kids and teens, this is how you get unstuck from that like head banging against a brick wall sensation that you get from the traditional understanding of advocacy, which is sharing information and explanations to convince someone to behave differently, using persuasion and convincing, and if they don't do that, using rewards or sanctions, right? If there's anything we're going to learn from our PDA kids on an existential level, is that you can't ever control another person, right? They have to be self-motivated to make the change and to change their own behavior. So all we can do is focus on ourselves, and it will shift things for you. So I'd love to hear, before I sign off, where are you going to either try out PLATO, set a boundary, or prune? Okay, so Sylvia says, how would you set a boundary for a 504 violation for things like jewelry? You know, I think that's a more difficult one, but like, for example, you have a right in a public school, I think, to support your child if they're not supporting them. So for example, like let's say it's circle time where they're not letting them use jewelry. My boundary might be like, okay, I'm choosing to bring my child in after circle time, right? That causes a little bit of conflict, but really it's like, I'm not going to convince this teacher after I've spent all this time and energy. If they're not going to do it, then we're going to make a different decision, right? And I know that's not always possible. These are illustrations, and maybe you have to move to pruning without boundaries if we're in a school environment. But this is conceptually a flipping of the script from what most of us are doing, because we're banging our heads against the wall trying to convince others to think differently. Okay? So the book I recommended is called Boundary Boss by Terry Cole. Yes, it will be reposted. And Audrey says palpitation and GI upset when you're setting a boundary. Of course. Feel tight and controlled when I set boundaries. Yes. Panic and doubting myself. Yes, absolutely. Anxiety, anger, confusion. Thank you, MD Toolbox. Nice to see you. Yay, I'm so glad it's a light bulb. Light bulbs are like what I live for. Like the aha moments. It makes me so happy. So Sylvia, I already answered your question. I do 8437. The Boundary Boss is the book. Tasha said, yes, I did this with the school, so pleased I did. I've already removed the school psychologist from the IEP team for denying his autism diagnosis. Amazing. So that's a great example of boundaries, right? Where you get to decide. I'm going to try the PLATO later today when I have my first conversation with my son's special ed teacher at our public school. Amazing. Yeah. So it can really shift the dynamic of the conversations, because it allows for competency and it allows for clarity of like, yeah, we can do that, or no, this might not work because of the dynamic within the classroom, but what about this, right? And we can start to make some progress. My 5.5-year-old will begin a new school this fall. It's a non-traditional private school, and I am so very anxious about it. I understand, Alina. I'd like to have a meeting before the end of the year with his OT teachers, and administrators. Yeah, and so really honing in on the unmet needs of your child and the specifics of what you can do to resolve the situation for the school, rather than focus, like coming in, which I've done, coming in, here are all the books on PDA, I'm going to educate you, and it's just like eyes glaze over, right? So I get it. Yeah. He doesn't have a 504 or IEP yet, and I'm not sure if they use them. Yeah. So you might just need to be talking about the needs rather than like using the IEP or a 504 as a legal structure to convince, right? Like my son is more accommodated at his private school where they're not legally required to accommodate him. So it really depends. My daughter went to school last week saying her leg didn't work. The whole team kept asking if she hurt her leg and she did not. I mentioned that it was an avoidance strategy. Yeah. I'm going to use this with my son's treatment team today. Yeah, experiment and report back. All right. Very good. Okay, thanks for sharing. Kathy Carrier in Southeast Michigan, the Mala Family Institute understands PDA, and they have a clinic in Plymouth, Ann Arbor, and the Detroit area. Yeah, okay. So anyways, I hope this was helpful to shift the mindset and your energy away from spaces of stuckness and movement towards making real progress with your child's needs and with your needs. So have a great day, everyone. It was great to see you with our weekly Coffee with Casey. Amy, it's MALA, Mala Family Institute. Yeah. It has been recorded. It will be turned into a podcast episode, and also it will be put on YouTube. So enjoy. Have a good Thursday. You guys will see each other soon. Okay, bye.